It's my privilege to be asked to moderate this discussion. The format is quite simple. As Diksha explained, we will hear quite briefly, I know it's very difficult in 10 minutes, but quite briefly, just get some highlights of the current situation in the different sub-member states, and that will be our initial knowledge or information base for the important second part of this panel, this workshop, where we're looking for inputs from everybody, not only from the speakers, and that is, as Diksha explained, to try and develop some common themes and some common issues that can be taken up as part of a regional campaign, which, after all, is what Saha's mandate is. So to understand what is happening on the ground, to see where we have some common issues or themes that would have a resonance in each of our countries, because our situations also have their own exceptional qualities, but to identify what is shared, what is common, and for that to then become the basis of a regional campaign. So that is clearly very important, rather than starting from the top and trying to implement a campaign that doesn't really have any echo in national movements and national struggles. So in the country presentations, what we hope we will understand is the current status of the right to adequate housing and the current status of the right or procedures or policies that offer protection, guarantees against forced evictions, arbitrary and forced evictions. So we want to understand where we are, and then beyond that knowledge sharing, in terms of the advocacy, to understand whether there are already within our own countries best practices, models that we have found useful, hopeful, and that might be of some relevance across our borders. So can we are there models or best practices that we can find that we can take across borders within South Asia? A second issue that I'm sure will come up is to put our mind to how we can narrow what is called the implementation gap. Sometimes, not always, and we will find out better in the next hour or so, but sometimes some constitutions and some countries do have laws, do have rights on paper. But as all of us know, the problem is how do we translate these rights into reality for our citizens, and particularly the most vulnerable and marginalized of our citizens. So how do we narrow the implementation gap, and how to move forward on lobbying for international obligations? And remember, this is another theme that needs to come up. We're looking at domestic experiences and domestic jurisdictions and our national laws and policies, but all of our countries are part of an international system, an international human rights system. We've all signed up to various UN conventions, and therefore we are obliged under international law, sovereignty, to invoke a word much loved in the country I come from. Sovereignty has to be understood also in terms of our obligations at a global level, our obligations to our own citizens. So how do we lobby for international norms, international obligations to be translated into binding laws? And how do we make sure those binding laws are supported by good policies, by good institutions that guarantee them, that enforce them? So that's just to give an overview, a very quick overview of some of our expectations from this workshop. But Diksha insisted, although I'm normally loath to do so, that I should also make some framing remarks. I believe my role is to moderate the discussion and manage time rather than for you to listen to me. But please bear with me for a few minutes, and I promise not to say much more later. So let me just very quickly run us through an overview of our situation. Well, of course, statistics around housing and on forced evictions are very difficult to find. It's very difficult to understand also how they are computed, because in most cases we simply have no way of generating or gathering this kind of information even at the national level. But one set of statistics that I came across from a source that I would normally not invoke, but that I do on this occasion because it's difficult for states to rebut it, suggests as follows, indicates as follows, that we have a situation where in excess of 212 million people are defined as homeless in South Asia. In other words, something like 40% of the population of the region. There's an estimated shortage of some 38 million housing units, again in the region. In the experience of millions of our citizens is that, particularly those who live in urban settlements, is that they live in so-called slums or informal settlements. In Dhaka, it's estimated, we will hear better from our colleague, it's estimated that in excess of 2 million people are without proper shelter. In Kabul, it is estimated that some 80% of the population live in informal settlements, something like 2.4 million people. 71% of urban households in India are defined as overcrowded. Karachi, it is estimated as, Karachi alone, it is estimated as something in excess of 600 slums, sheltering around 7.6 million people, and that is almost half of the estimated population of the city. So, it's very difficult to absorb all of this. I simply wanted to give you a sense of the scale of the situation. We will be talking about country experiences, but may I please begin by establishing, by us having a consensus on our understanding of these terms that we will be using. The UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights it has explained that the right to housing should not be interpreted in a narrow or restrictive sense. The right to housing, in other words, is not simply about having a roof over one's head. Rather, it is the right to housing means the right to live somewhere in security, in peace, and in dignity. And I think that those are three very, very important words: security, peace, and dignity. And the expert committee, which is the body, as you know, charged to interpret the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, has also listed or detailed dimensions of what the right to housing, the right to adequate housing involves. Legal security of tenure, availability of services, materials, facilities, and infrastructure to residents, affordability, habitability, accessibility, location, and cultural adequacy. So I think this is a very rich, understanding, which surely this is an understanding that also resonates with us. And as to forced evictions, as defined by the committee in its general comment on the 7th, forced evictions are permanent or temporary removal of people against their will, permanent or temporary removal against their will of individuals, families, and or communities from their homes and land or land which they occupy, without the provision of and access to appropriate forms of legal or other protection. And the committee also notes, and I hope this is also a theme that will come up in our discussion, it identifies groups that are particularly vulnerable when it comes to post-arbitrary evictions. And it identifies them as women, children, youth, older persons, indigenous people, ethnic and other minorities, and other vulnerable individuals and groups. So the committee has also explained that women in particular, some of the obstacles that they face to realizing their right to housing include violence, gender-based violence, discriminatory cultural and social norms, discriminatory family and personal laws, privatization, unaffordability of housing for women, impacts of natural disasters. We are approaching the 10th anniversary of the tsunami, something forced evictions, and HIV/AIDS. So these are based upon complaints that it has received, based upon communications, based upon expert studies. It's identified that these are some among the many obstacles that women in particular face. So let me wind up by just drawing attention to we will be talking about South Asian jurisdictions, and hopefully we will hear some discussion on some of the important judgments that have been handed down, both maybe positive and unfortunately more recently negative. But may I also draw everyone's attention so that there's also some learning from outside of our region to the experience in South Africa. As many of you know, the post-apartheid constitution in South Africa was very unique in that it drew into its enforceable or binding obligations many rights that had previously been viewed as simply exhortatory, persuasive, directive principles, so ESC rights in particular. And so in South Africa we have Article 26 of the South African Constitution, which states unequivocally, everyone has the right to have adequate housing. Everyone has the right to have adequate housing. So that's not, and Article 26 in its subparagraph 3, no one may be evicted from their home or have their home demolished without an order of court made after considering all relevant circumstances. No legislation may permit arbitrary evictions. Of course, the leading case that all of us are familiar with, the Grootboom case, in the judgment, the Constitutional Court of South Africa held the indignity suffered as a result of evictions from homes, forced removals, and the relocation to land often wholly inadequate for housing needs has to be with a system in which the state must strive to provide access to adequate housing for all. And where that exists, refrain from permitting people to be removed unless it can be justified. So really here what we have is a very good explication of the international norm. We cannot at this point in time presume that there is a binding obligation on the state to ensure that immediately every state has the duty to provide housing. But it is the responsibility of the state to ensure that it is always moving towards that goal of universal provision of shelter, that shelter should be adequate, and even where the state is unable to move forward on its positive obligations, at the very least to refrain from denying people the housing that they may have, to render protection to people who are vulnerable to losing the limited shelter rights that they may already have. So this is simply to draw attention to some learnings that we can hopefully also draw on from outside of our region.